Hi, everybody. My name is Natalie Yeadon, and I'm one of the co-owners and managing directors with Impetus Digital. For those of you who don't know what Impetus Digital does, our company has built some of the best-in-class asynchronous and synchronous virtual collaboration and communication tools for life science companies. We have, for the last 12 years, helped companies with virtual advisory boards, steering committees, medical education, investigator programs, and even have done things like internal brand plan rollouts. We've actually helped with things like PCPA submissions and all kinds of other things in between. Obviously, this has been a huge impact since COVID-19, but we've been doing this globally and across the globe. But more importantly, what we really believe at Impetus is that everything starts with a foundational conversation, a big, courageous conversation, the kinds of conversations we like to have here with some of the provocateurs, the digital leading edge, the thinkers, the entrepreneurs, the people like the Evas of the world who are doing things that are different and they're advocating for things that we can all truly and collectively work to positively disrupt healthcare. So we're super excited to have these conversations with people like Eva. So I just want to introduce you to her, and so happy to have her on the show. Eva is actually an expert, what you call a dot connector. I love that phrase. She's a really passionate change maker, and we love people who are in that thinking space, because that's really what we love and surround ourselves with people at Impetus Digital. She's a solution sleuth, and for things like public policy, developing and building meaningful partnerships and relationships, and also for things social impact for good. So some really good tangy things that we're going to want to sink our teeth into today. She has extensive experience working for not-for-profit healthcare societies, and she's currently the executive director for the Quebec Cancer Coalition. They're a leading advocate for people who are affected by cancer in order to improve the healthcare system, specifically in Quebec. With this same organization, she's been able to serve as a member of the board since 2008. She's been the vice president from 2012 to 2016, and she's also a member of the organizing committee of the annual conference to end cancer since 2010. She has a bachelor's degree in psychology and linguistics from McGill University and an MBA from HEC Montreal. And she also is working towards a master's degree in healthcare transformation at the University of Texas. So Eva Villalba, we are so happy and thrilled to have you on our show today.
Thanks a lot, Natalie.
And I know I completely screwed up your last name, so I'm going to try it again. Villalba. There it goes. It's my tongue twister. Okay. You said it. You got it right.
You call me Eva.
You're awesome. So love the background. I love the fact that you're a solution sleuth and a dot connector, and a very interesting background trajectory that you had through the course. And I even love what you're doing right now, which is getting this healthcare transformation degree. Tell us a little bit about the background, and where and how you got to where you are today, because it sounds like a really exciting trajectory.
So, like maybe over a dozen years ago, I got into, I was always a bit in the nonprofit world and volunteering, and I started working at a palliative home care organization. And I think that's where I also got involved with the Quebec Cancer Coalition, and I saw how some people didn't necessarily have a voice in terms of affecting public policy, like families or patients going through difficult times in their last months or years of life. They confronted challenges, and there was very little advocacy at the time. And so at that time, I felt it was really important to advocate for palliative home care, for palliative care in general, and for advocating for patients. And what I saw is that we live in a real democracy, and when citizens mobilize and engage, we can actually make a difference. And so that's really how I got into this field of patient advocacy, and through seeing the massive impact that we can actually have when we rally with stakeholders, when we mobilize citizens, and when we actually get the opportunity to speak to policymakers and make a change on behalf of the people that we represent. In our case, it's people affected by cancer, so patients, survivors, and their caregivers.
Love it. And it's such an amazing area. And I really kind of want to dig into this a little bit. So really kind of fill in the blanks for those of us who are not really familiar with what is going on with the Quebec Cancer Coalition. What exactly is this entity? And what are some of the primary purposes and, I guess, deliverables or objectives that your organization has?
Absolutely. So we're a coalition of over 60 nonprofits in oncology. They that all care about improving cancer care in Quebec. But we have a lot of pan-Canadian organizations. So like Ovarian Cancer Canada, Bladder Cancer Canada. We have the Quebec Breast Cancer Foundation. Many like that are cancer specific for a specific kind of cancer. And then we also have we represent all types of cancers and all phases of the cancer journey. So that not only includes prevention, active access to medications and care, and survivorship and palliative care, but also something that's really important to us is clinical trials. So how do clinical trials fit in all of this? And how can we increase participation in clinical trials for patients? And so what the coalition does is it rallies together all kinds of organizations that are interested in improving public policy in healthcare and oncology in Quebec. And we actually amplify their voices, see that, the dot connector thing comes into play, where we see that several of our members actually have common objectives and common goals, and that together we're much stronger than we are individually. And so we help them to collaborate, to work together. I would say that one of my greatest strengths is getting people that would otherwise not talk to each other to not only talk to each other, but actually work together towards something like a common goal, and to succeed in that. And so that's something that I'm pretty proud that we're doing. For example, during COVID, when COVID started, we were one of the first organizations to actually survey patients to see what the impact of the COVID measures were on their care, on how they felt, on their anxiety levels. And we rallied all of our members, and we actually came up not only with a survey, but actually with recommendations to the government based on that. And we got lots of media attention, but more importantly, I think, is attention from public policy makers that were actually able to implement some of our recommendations, because we had the credibility, but we also had the diversity of voices, the key stakeholders that were mobilized. And so that's really what we do, like concretely, is we mobilize the key stakeholders in order to achieve common goals. And really it's all about improving public policy in a way that tangibly helps patients and their families.
So really interesting. And I'm not going to tell you anything that you don't already know. I mean, a lot of times Canadians in general say, well, things are different in Quebec. And, it's just, it's a different entity and they think differently. So of course there's going to be slightly different and special policies, recommendations, the way the government legislates things in its own ecosystem. So let's get into this. If we brought up COVID-19 already, there was the pre-COVID-19 reality, and then there's the post-COVID-19 reality. And I don't care if it's Quebec or the US or Ontario or anywhere else, everybody was affected by this, and specifically oncology patients. And you mentioned very specifically things like clinical trials. There was almost like a moratorium, this almost sort of an abrupt stop, not only to capturing new patients to clinical trials, but also clinical trials that were currently being run. So huge impacts on things like discovery, et cetera, but also in terms of patients being able to get into their treatment. So let's pick this apart step by step. So COVID-19 and clinical trials, what were some of the things that you were able to work with the government in changing some of the mindset, some of the legislation that has opened the door to some positive things there?
Absolutely. So we actually, after we did our 2 surveys on the impacts of clinical trial, the impacts of the COVID pandemic on cancer patients, one of the things that came up both times was that patients and even clinicians were quite bothered that clinical trials had completely stopped in Quebec from March to we did our survey, our last survey in May, and what we were hearing is that there was no plan to reopen clinical trials before November of December of 2020. And considering that most cancer patients that need clinical trials are in advanced stages or stage 4, they don't have 6 months to wait. And so that was unacceptable for us. And we really quickly mobilized clinical research centers, clinicians, patient advocacy organizations, and even government stakeholders to look at the problem, to say, okay, why did they close? Is the context the same? How soon can we open? What are the bottlenecks? What are the challenges? Let's find some practical solutions by brainstorming all together. And what we found was there were different best practices at different centers, but they weren't necessarily communicating with each other. And so we allowed that discussion to happen. And we worked in collaboration with, not in competition or in confrontation with the government. And so by bringing them in, we actually succeeded in getting them to send a clarifying memo. So the first memo came out in March saying, close everything, unless you see that there's a clear benefit, and nobody interpreted it that way. So everyone except for one center stopped doing clinical trials. And so because of this initiative that we undertook with the key stakeholders, in June, the government issued a new directive saying, okay, if you feel ready, you can reopen clinical trials. And that was a huge win, because we went from, we might open in November or December to opening in June. So that was a direct impact, I believe, from the mobilization that we were able to create. And then based on our report, we actually were able to speak to not only the people in charge of clinical trials at the Ministry of Health, but also the Ministry of Economy and Innovation that funds a lot of that research. And then at different levels of the Ministry of Health, showing them that one of the main problems was, for example, the fact that clinical trials are not considered part of the culture of healthcare. They're considered a nice to have bonus, which is sponsored by industry or sponsored by the Ministry of Economy, and not necessarily the problem of the healthcare system. And so we really are pushing very strongly on that integration of clinical trials within the trajectory of care, within the healthcare system, that it does become a priority. Because if the general public has learned anything during this pandemic, is how important it is to have rapid and efficient and safe clinical trials, to have industry actually work together with government in order to provide the necessary medications and treatments to patients. And so it was really positive. And we continue. I actually just presented about this same report this morning at a conference on clinical trials in New Brunswick. So it's actually gone very far, this report, and we're very lucky that the Quebec government is now very open and receptive to hearing what's going on the ground. And I think that we're able to do that because we're not just speaking on behalf of ourselves or even our members, but actually all the key stakeholders. And so we're really happy and proud about that. And so in this second wave, we've actually asked for a commitment that not only will oncology care and services continue despite a second or third or fourth wave, but that as much as possible, clinical trials will also be protected, because they're not a nice to have, they're essential.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And I want to congratulate you, the coalition, and all of the stakeholders in the ecosystem that you're working with for such a phenomenal accomplishment. Now, the interesting thing is healthcare, industry, cancer has taken a bit of a front seat, if you will, because of COVID-19. You're starting to see, again, because of the vaccines, you're starting to see explanations on the news about mechanisms of action and freezers, and suddenly the general public is understanding about healthcare, and it's all in everybody's, lingo and front language. So, is this an opportunity for your coalition to take advantage of this timing, of this perspective, of this focus? And with that in perspective, is there an opportunity to shine the light on other concerns that are going on with the coalition beyond just the clinical trials? What are sort of the other things that you're trying to work on around legislation and policy?
Absolutely. So definitely, COVID has been a catalyst for change, which is great, because one of the challenges that we face is the inertia of the system to actually adopt and modernize to adopt new changes and to modernize and to, get to 2020. So for example, it's extremely frustrating to everyone in the Quebec healthcare system that we still use fax. That's ridiculous. In 2020, we should not use faxes anymore. And so the government had been talking about it, and it's coming, but it's never arriving. And so telemedicine was something that we were promoting really strongly last year. When are we going to have this? And then so we see with COVID, all of a sudden, we're able to do things that we supposedly couldn't do before. And so I think that that's the really positive thing about COVID. Now, in terms of our other priorities, I mean, to link it to clinical trials, another one of our concerns at the coalition is to ensure regional equity. So to ensure that you don't only get the best care if you're living in in an urban center, and this applies all over Canada. So how can we best serve, how can we provide this universal healthcare that we're so proud of to everyone? And so we can't have, centers of excellence everywhere. We can't have clinical research centers in every single town, but how can we allow every Canadian and every Quebecer in our case to actually benefit from that same standard of care? And so regional equity is really important. And I think that telemedicine is one such way of, for example, getting people in remote regions to actually have access to specialists that they can't otherwise have access to. And to have access to, for example, clinical trials. So that's one of our priorities. The other two that I would mention that are really top, well, three maybe, that are top on our list. Number one is to have a cancer registry that actually works and is up to date. We're very embarrassed that every time the Canadian Cancer Society publishes the results, there's always an asterisk next to Quebec because we have data from like 2011. It's really embarrassing that in 2020 we don't have that, especially because Quebec is an artificial intelligence hub. And so we have all this expertise, but we're not using it for healthcare. This current government is really trying to accelerate that, but it's been like 10 years that we're waiting to have a cancer registry. And so we can talk more about that later if you like. The other priority is preparing the whole system. And here we will need, legislation and policy change, really preparing ourselves for precision medicine and personalized medicine. So we know it's not just coming, it's not the future, it's already here, but it's going to be more and more prevalent. And we're not ready in the sense that we don't have the infrastructure. We really have a serious challenge with access to diagnostic testing. And so we're doing specific actions on that in 2021 to really see, okay, what is the environment in Quebec? How could we make it better? Why do we keep sending our tests to the US? In terms of delays and in terms of costs and in terms of keeping the funds, here in Canada, it just makes more sense to use the expertise, the brain power, and we even have the infrastructure. We just don't have the mandate. So that's another one of our main priorities. And in terms of also the approval process of precision medicine, our specific take on that is that, for example, when you're talking about personalized medicine, there has to be a paradigm shift with the HTAs, so INES and CADIS at the same time. And we really have to recognize that when you're talking about subgroups of patients, even though it might be a common cancer or common disease like lung cancer, for example, you're not talking about thousands and thousands of people. You're talking about maybe, 25, 100 people. You can't use the same evaluation framework. And so we're trying to do some awareness building around that. The last thing would be value-based healthcare, which I'm sure we're going to talk about more. So value-based healthcare is absolutely one of our main priorities. And
oh my God, there's so much to dig in there, and I'm going to want to double click on all of these. So we're going to spend some time. I just kind of wanted to spend a couple more minutes on clinical trials because you brought up something that was really intriguing. And one of the core tenets around clinical trials has to do with suddenly bridging the gap and kind of taking things away with the geographical boundaries associated with it just being Quebec only. Now that we have this opportunity to do things through telehealth, is suddenly global trials are now available to Quebecers. Ultimately, based on the fact that there's still faxing, there's still legislation and infrastructure and requirements for ink signatures, is what are we doing around e-consent? Getting away from these heavy 40, 60, 70-page consent documents to the average Quebecer to be able to digitally sign and access these trials.
Yeah.
What kinds of thinking and policy changing is there going to be in order to make that happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that was actually one of our recommendations, and we did push ahead on that. So remote monitoring was a huge thing, and then e-consent, or even just so at the level we not only lobbied government, we also lobbied industry. And we said, look, there's things that you're doing well, and there's things that you could really improve. Okay, and here they are. Let's have a chat. You know, what can you do? What can you not do? Some sponsors were very flexible, and others were very rigid. But they're both the government and industry have really become more flexible about it. And so I think that the solution is actually more inclusive language around consent without reducing the level of informed consent, of providing all of the necessary information and answering questions of patients. But does it need to be by paper? We saw that during COVID. It's a waste of time, and it's putting the patient at risk to go in to sign something by hand. In 2020, that shouldn't be the case. If you can sign something to buy a house, online, then why can't you do it for a clinical trial? And so we are seeing that the government is open to this idea. We are seeing that sponsors are now using things like Adobe Sign and other secure electronic signing platforms. And basically the trick is to have language that is inclusive enough to say that you need to have documented informed consent.
Mm-hmm.
How it's documented, it could be by video, it could be by audio, it could be a number of forms. It could be electronic, but as long as it's not exclusively in paper, then we're on our way to, getting into the future of, clinical trials and really acting like we're in 2020 and not 1980.
Before people get into a clinical trial, they obviously need the appropriate diagnosis, right? So we've got people all over the place. Things are happening. We know that there's certain percentages of people that are going to be getting some of the top cancers: colorectal, breast cancer, prostate cancer. There's diagnostic programs, there's screening programs. What is the coalition doing and the thinking in the framework around diagnosis and screening programs, potentially virtually using telehealth and other potential, what they call digital biomarkers, screeners, sensors, facial recognition software, software as a medical device, all kinds of other things that are kind of getting into the system. I know that we're far away from that. We're still just talking about e-consent and digital signatures, but what is some of the short to long, the mid to long-term thinking that the coalition is thinking about to ensure that the average Quebecer can easily and automatically and seamlessly be able to diagnose ahead of the time so that we can actually improve on long-term outcomes?
So there's two parts of your question. One is, how do you get the right patient to the right clinical trial? And I think that, having a registry, which not only tells us mortality and morbidity and frequency of different cancers, but also can actually help us to match patients with a specific biomarker to a specific trial, or match them with a specific condition to a specific trial. So that's number one. And I mean, our registry, our Quebec Cancer Registry, is probably a little far from that, but with the capabilities that we have now in Quebec with artificial intelligence, we know for a fact that can be implemented very quickly. And so we're working with a lot of leaders in the field to kind of propose solutions along those lines. And we're working with many of our organizations that are in clinical trials. We have one, for example, Innovation Exactis, which actually has a repository, a registry of patients with all of their molecular and biomarker data in there in order to match them to clinical trials. So that's number one. And the second thing is about what you mentioned about wearables or telehealth and how that can be used. And so I can think of one specific great example at the Jewish General Hospital in Montreal, where they actually used telehealth to remote monitor their patients. And that is something that we're seeing as a really good option, not just for clinical trials, but even for providing care to people that aren't in remote in urban centers or close to the hospital. And so I do believe that within the next 5 years, we absolutely will be using wearables more and more frequently, having that digital integration. And again, the Jewish General Hospital is doing this really innovative new project with a digital health hub, which is going to really revolutionize, I think, the way that we do things in Quebec. They're really big innovators there. And so I do believe that having that, I think that the new question that we need to ask ourselves is, what is the added value of the patient going to the hospital? Is there really a need for the patient to physically be there? Sometimes there is. And honestly, the patients need that physical or personal contact at least, because one of the things that we saw is, because of the heightened risk of cancer patients, they were feeling extremely isolated. And sometimes they do really need to see the doctor in person, but other times they don't. Other times it is not an added value for the patient to have to go in person to the hospital. And more often than not, the patient would rather be served closer to their home. So we have local clinics, we have the pharmacy, we have home care, which has been underutilized. And so I think we need to think of the healthcare system more and not just of the hospital system. Because I really believe that one of the main problems that happened in Quebec with COVID is that we tried to protect the hospital instead of the system, and the system instead of the vulnerable patient. Because if we thought about protecting the vulnerable patient first, we would have remembered that there's a lot in long-term care facilities, and the long-term care facilities are also part of our healthcare system. So it was kind of like we just narrowly focused on protecting the system as defined as only the hospitals. And so now that we've learned from the first and now we're in the second wave, I think that we really need to reflect on using all of the healthcare system and to getting to patients where they are. And I think that telehealth and wearables will absolutely be part of that solution.
And a huge component of patient-reported outcomes, getting them part of the system and starting to legitimize things like patient portals and integrating them with electronic health records, and legitimizing the communication between physicians and patients. So we've got a long road ahead, but it's super exciting, and the technology is there. Yeah. It's just really getting mindset and legislation and habits reformulated around the technology. So you brought up so many really great things there that I think are worth evaluating, and just being able to have access to all these. And I love that idea of reformulating the question, because that is so very much part of this issue of, we talk a lot about patient centricity, but it's a whole other thing indulging in systems innovation or systematic innovations thinking from a very different perspective. So the question comes down to around the vulnerability, or really the different components of how patients are accessing. So as we look at these different players in the ecosystem, what do and for example, we just recently heard that Amazon is launching their electronic pharmacy. Yeah. Again, detrimental effects to the mom and pop shops, but there's nothing to say that the mom and pop shops can't use Amazon for their logistics, which is basically shipping their medication. So how do we leverage that or look at the silver lining on it? So with all of that said, e-prescribing, the use of electronic delivery, and potentially other sort of diagnostics, for example, Bluetooth type of stethoscopes and other sorts of things. Is this part of the thinking and the recommendations that the coalition is making about the future of point of care, and where the vulnerable, immunocompromised cancer patient is being diagnosed, seen, sustained, maintained through the course of their therapy or their condition?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, next year we are having a symposium on telehealth and what we've learned in COVID that we absolutely need to not just keep but promote. And really, for example, when we talk about telehealth and telemedicine, we need to remember the social determinants of health as well, and making sure that vulnerable populations don't get excluded by technology. So what do we do about that? I mean, the current government ran on a platform of promising high-speed internet as a right. High-speed internet, it's coming. Apparently, they've mentioned it again, but they're promising to bring high-speed internet to remote regions, because how will you have telehealth? These are the people that have difficulty accessing specialists, even primary care, never mind diagnostic testing and advanced stuff like clinical trials. But if they don't have the internet, they can't participate. And so we don't want to make vulnerable populations more vulnerable. So that equity lens is definitely something that we always include in our analysis. And I don't know, I think in terms of how do we bring this forward, I think that the patient has been left out of the conversation. Most of the decisions that we make are based on what's good for the system. And I think that there's a strong paradigm shift, and this relates completely to value-based healthcare, and what we're really trying to promote is determining value based on what is good for the patient and not necessarily what's good for the system, because ultimately the patient does not want more healthcare. They want more health. And it's the duty of our public payer system, it's the duty of our universal healthcare system to provide health. If you provide health, then the patient gets out of the system and they're not overusing it. It's not an all-you-can-eat buffet. They don't want to go to the hospital. Nobody wants to be sick. But if you proactively provide health, then it is good for the system. We use less resources. We optimize resources because the patient doesn't want to be a glutton of healthcare services. They want the least amount possible. That means they're healthy. That means they're happy. That means they're a contributing member of society. So it's a win-win for everyone. But the definition of value in value-based healthcare is patient health outcomes divided by cost. And so if we get the best health outcomes for patients at an optimal cost, then that is value, and that's what we should base our decision on. So that relates back to precision medicine, because currently everyone gets the standard of care. Everyone gets the same treatment. If it doesn't work, you try the second line. If it doesn't work, you try the third line, fourth line. But the 3 times that you tried a treatment that didn't work, it's not good for you as a patient, and it's not good for the system. The system is also wasting resources, money, access to someone else that could have come in. And so giving the right treatment at the right time for the right patient is value-based healthcare. It is good for precision medicine, but it's also good for the system because you're being much more targeted in your intervention, and so you're going to get better results. And so that's something that we're really trying to raise awareness about as well.
So what's interesting about what you're saying is every manufacturer in the industry is taking a look at their little bite-sized component of that value discussion, right? So as it pertains to their product or products. And what ends up happening is then the government is looking at it from their own specific budget silos. Who is asking the bigger question? Who is doing the value-based computations and systems evaluation from a very high level, holistic, inclusive of all of these players to really evaluate what that precision model looks like? And how are you getting buy-in from all of these sole silos, with their own vested interests and agendas to come together to make something like that work?
So you are hitting it on the head, Natalie. Everyone's looking at just their little portion of the pasture, and no one's looking at the big picture. Now, the reason that I started this extra additional master's in healthcare transformation is because I'm really obsessed and committed to value-based healthcare in Canada, because I truly believe that our system is even better primed and ready for value-based healthcare than even the US, because they always have the pressure of, oh, but how do we make money off the patient? And I think that in our universal healthcare system, we actually have that luxury of asking what is best for the patient, because the patient is the payer, the citizen is the client, which is not the case in the United States. And I think that something that has to change is that the pharma industry has to start thinking of the patients as their ultimate clients, because currently they're thinking of the governments as their clients. And so I think that the more we think of what is best for the patient, the better it'll be at the system level, at the industry level. But ultimately, I really think that Quebec in particular, the government has shown an openness to value-based care, not just as a pilot project, but on a larger scale. The problem is that we still need to do demonstration projects. We still need to know what it looks like in real life. And so our coalition has actually partnered in collaboration with the Conference Board of Canada. They have a division called VBHC Canada, and we're actually doing oncology, VBHC, value-based healthcare demonstration projects in Quebec in oncology. We're starting with colorectal cancer, then we'll do lung, breast down the line, and others. But the idea is to demonstrate what does value-based healthcare look like at a complex level. So in oncology, usually most value-based healthcare demonstration projects are in easier things like hip and knee replacements, which are very discrete, they're very time limited, you can measure everything, there's fewer variables. But to do it on a larger scale in something like oncology that basically eats up at least 50% of our budget, a little bit more of the pharmacy budget at hospitals, I think it'll be really interesting to see how we can apply this first in oncology, but ultimately the dream or the vision for the next 5 years is to have maybe Quebec first because we're ready, but I think that other provinces are soon going to follow suit and see how we can really adopt value-based healthcare at the systems level. How can we define value from the point of view of the patient? And really that comes from, crazy concept, I know, but talking to patients. So that's where the patient-reported outcomes come in. Even just having the conversation as clinicians, when clinicians have the conversation, and this is the essence of value-based healthcare, is before you decide the course of treatment, ask the patient, what are the outcomes that matter to them? And not in clinical terms. What the outcomes might be, besides not having cancer, they also want to be able to ride their bike again because they're avid cyclists. They want to be able to play with their children or grandchildren. They want to be able to garden. They want to be able to have healthy relationships with their partner and not have sexual difficulties because of the cancer treatments, or they want to be able to have children in the future. And so preserving their fertility is important. But if this conversation is not had at the beginning, which it's currently not really done, then you can adjust the trajectory of care. And that's what value-based healthcare is all about, is talk to the patient from the beginning and adjust the trajectory of care according to the outcomes that are important to them. So the clinician can think about the clinical outcomes, like let's make sure you don't have cancer or that we keep it under control. But that's not all that matters to patients. And from having worked in palliative care, we know that it's not about quantity. Quantity is not important to patients so much as quality. If you get 6 months of extra life, but you're suffering the whole time, you'd rather have, 3 months of really good quality, but at least you're enjoying your life. And so it's that question about quality over quantity is really important, and just having that conversation with patients and putting patients really at the center of our decisions.
How does this framework, habit of thinking, methodology, workflow get incorporated and standardized in the typical oncologist's, hematology, whatever office, as part of the natural progression of that conversation, which usually can be very flighting, checking things off, computer, checking the lab results, whatever. There's a compassionate, empathic, empathetic conversation that needs to take place. And what we also are finding is that we need to displace the current conversation or the mindset that is going on with the typical physician who's been socialized to say, this product is expensive, this product is not. This product is brand name, this product is generic. This product is on formulary or special authorized, whatever I'm using. And so it's very much part of the lingo and the methodology and the work process, as opposed to thinking from a values, a value standpoint, is looking at the entire systems as it relates to that patient and making the best decision. So how are, as industry, government, coalitions, agencies, working to change that conversation?
So that's a good point. First of all, in the VBHC formula, when you're looking at health outcomes divided by costs, it's health outcomes and costs over the trajectory of care, not one moment. Currently, the one and only thing that we measure is how much a medication costs. We don't even know how much a bed, like how much it costs for an additional hospitalization, all of the resources that are put into that. You know, how much does it cost when we give the wrong medication and the person is sick and has to go back and has to see all these specialists? We don't know. We're only measuring, oh, that medication is very expensive. But then what are the costs that follow from that when you give the wrong medication? So number one is the accounting structure and the financing of our healthcare system has to be reformed. And in Quebec, there is currently a project underway from the Ministry of Health to actually map the costs in the trajectory of care. So this is a huge improvement. We haven't seen the results yet, but we know that it's happening, and we should be getting the results within next year. So that's one positive step in the right direction, and that's going to need to happen all over Canada for it to work. So that's number one. Number two is looking at not just the costs initially, but looking at the costs throughout, and also the improvement or not of health outcomes throughout. So the problem is also that narrow focus, where we really have to have a more longitudinal kind of view over, you know, ensuring that we get the best possible outcomes for the best cost over the trajectory of that disease. So that actually serves as an incentive to do prevention, to do the right testing, for example, and not to take a shot in the dark and hope that it works. And so I think that those are really key elements in order to really make value-based healthcare work. And then the last thing, with what they're doing at the University of Texas, Austin, where I'm doing my master's in healthcare transformation, they're actually training med students on this approach. And so that's really where you get the massive transformational change. But we do in Canada still have been pushing med students to, and in general, the new doctors they still do have more of this patient-centered approach instead of the previous paternalistic approach that we used to have in healthcare, where the doctor tells you something and you're not allowed to question. And so there is a movement towards patient centricity, but it's usually tokenism and not everyone applies it in the same way. But one thing that we're pushing for in Quebec specifically, and I'm also doing a course on that, it's at the University of Montreal in the Faculty of Medicine. It's on what's called the Montreal model of patient partnership. And that is where the patient is an equal partner. It's more than just shared decision making. It's actually empowering the patient and recognizing the expertise of the patient in their own lived experience. And so the clinician has the clinical knowledge, but the patient has the experience of what works for them, what doesn't, how they feel about it, what they prefer in terms of outcomes. And so that conversation needs to happen. And so that's, I think, another parallel paradigm shift that's happening. And I do think that as the government starts opening up, because, for example, INES, our HTA in Quebec, has started looking at value-based looking at evaluations through a value-based lens. We know that they're also starting with value-based procurement in the Ministry of Health. So that's also an improvement in terms of, you know, government openness towards value-based healthcare. And so I think as everyone continues to kind of inch along this path towards greater inclusion of the patient perspective in terms of value, I do think that doctors will also get on board, because it's a win-win situation.
With the increased innovations, new diagnostics and biomarkers, cancer therapies like the CAR T cells and all sorts of other things that are happening genomically and otherwise, is ultimately the goal of value-based healthcare, especially in oncology, to ultimately save money of the healthcare system? And the question comes down to is, how is that assessment going to take place? Over what time? And is there going to be the inclusion or the leverage, as you had mentioned earlier, about artificial intelligence, being able to tackle and sort and analyze all of these data lakes, these registries, these repositories of information that have information all over the place, to be able to do things that most humans wouldn't be able to do, which is to assess over time, doing value-based medicine is going to result in X dollars saved or X dollars in it, over indulgence, and this worked or this didn't. How is that conversation, or how is that thinking, and what things need to be put into place in order to make that type of an evaluation?
For sure. I think that the innovations and treatments that you mentioned, immunotherapy, CAR T, a lot of these targeted precision medicines based on mutations, they're not incremental changes. They're not slight improvements. They're really radical transformational changes to our healthcare system and to with CAR T, you can have a previously fatal disease to be cured. That's what we're seeing even with the genetic therapies. So we see really promising results in terms of radical change. And so how do we do the kind of pharmacoeconomic analysis to justify the investment in that? And I do think that we need to start, first of all, like I mentioned before, we need to measure. We cannot improve what we don't measure. And so we're not measuring much right now. We're only measuring one type of cost. And we need to see also how that impacts the larger system in terms of better utilization of resources and optimization of resources, and improving access to others that these people would be taking if they were going through the standard of care. And so these are all things that don't come naturally right now, that aren't the reflex, of the system. And so I think that's going to be really important. And then leveraging, like you said, artificial intelligence is going to allow us to really, but we need to have the data in order to use the artificial intelligence. So the first step is to actually have the registries, have the data collected in a meaningful way. You look at the outcomes, but not measuring outcomes just to measure outcomes. We need to measure outcomes in order to improve. And so right now, we're not measuring much. And what we do measure, we don't always apply it to continuous improvement. And so once we do have that information, for example, once we have a Quebec Cancer Registry that works, ideally, we would be able to go back and see, okay, those that have used immunotherapy are still with us today, or they last, 6 more years so far than those that have done the standard of care. So let's look at, when should we be giving immunotherapy and when should we be giving the standard of care? And how do we keep continuously improving and learning from the data? Because that is where we're lagging right now. We have the ability to analyze data. What we don't have is the data. And so garbage in, garbage out, so we really need to have quality data, up to date, searchable by public and private researchers, anonymized, confidential, all of that. We really need to ensure that even the public feels a sense of trust for the protection of their data. Absolutely, we're very strong proponents of that. But at the same time, we recognize that researchers need to have data in order to make the best public policy decisions, in order to even tweak and modify the types of treatments that we're going to receive. But we need that data. And currently, we're not acting like we're in 2020. We're acting
and it's kind of shocking, actually. As you have very succinctly explained, is data is the new gold, right? Or it's the new oil. Yeah. And quite frankly, these data lakes are where the refineries are happening, and then we can use these things for population health management, et cetera. But if COVID-19 was actually a mirror into what people are really thinking around privacy, security, bioethics. We couldn't even get COVID-19 contact tracing approved and integrated and used in ample use across the country. I mean, this is like a pandemic, like people's lives, and it was happening everywhere, and everybody was equally affected, not just some people who had specific conditions in cancer. And we couldn't even get that right. And again, there's no judgment about certain provinces. Ontario took it on. Quebec, I think, still hasn't approved it. So how are we going to get past this? There's a discourse and a belief system that ultimately, this is not to be trusted. I can't put my data online. this is a much bigger issue, and I don't want to get into the politicization of weaponization of mask versus not mask and COVID-19 tracing versus not. But how do we overcome this?
So that's a good question. It's ironic because we share so much information on social media, and people are livid when they think about their data being shared, their health data being shared. But there are so many measures put in place to protect health data. Like in Quebec, even doctors and providers, they are annoyed by how many firewalls are up. Like even the pharmacists can't have access to all of your health data. So it's not like a free for all of sharing your data. And I do believe that there's a new law coming out soon about the protection of data in Quebec as well. And so I do personally feel very confident that our government is doing everything that they can to protect that confidential information. However, we need to also weigh the risks and the benefits of sharing aggregated, anonymized, confidential data, but that gives us an insight into, our screening programs working, our prevention programs working. Are we seeing a net reduced mortality in certain cancers because of the innovations in treatments? We need that information in order to make better decisions and to treat people better, to treat them more effectively. And so I think that's the message, and we have communicated this to different levels of government, that they're doing good things, but they're really not communicating it very well to the public. And so they need to communicate the benefits.
I think there's a huge educational opportunity. Like, for example, I think the what I call the digital citizen, most people in Canada do not realize that we actually have a Canadian digital charter. And I think if you ask the average consumer, they would have no idea what that is and what it even means. But I think like a huge educational campaign is really the beginning. Yeah. You also brought something up that was really pivotal around the digital divide. And I think a core component to even retrieving data, getting any of these really cool things, clinical trials, patient-reported outcomes, e-consents, developing innovations, starts with access. We've already talked about the whole idea of value-based, but we're talking about access of telehealth. We're talking about access of broadband. We're talking about access to even the drugs that some people may not even be able to afford. So what are we doing around access?
So I think that what's been missing from, the conversation in general and advocacy, I think patient advocate organizations are probably the only ones talking about the social determinants of health as it relates to access, because it's all good and well if we want to encourage, remote monitoring of vital signs and telemedicine. But what if you don't even have a computer? Like, never mind, you don't have internet, you don't even have a computer, you might not have a smartphone, you might not know how to use it. And so what, you just get left out. And so I think that has to become a reflex, not just of patient advocacy organizations, but we are the loudest voices that will be annoying and remind everyone consistently, hey, what about, equity, and what about the social determinants of health? How is industry factoring that in? How is the government factoring that in? Don't just assume that everyone, if you put it out, people will come, And so that's number one. That with the access, I do believe that that's where Quebec and the rest of Canada have kind of, different challenges. I mean, everyone has challenges, and we still do have challenges in Quebec. But I think that the price of medications, there's currently lots going on in that at the federal level that we don't necessarily have to get into today. But I do think that in Quebec, we have different programs that allow access. So we have special access programs. So there's a lot less of that, of patients falling through the cracks. But I do know that in the rest of Canada, that's a serious challenge. And we definitely wouldn't want that here. So we do have bridging programs. And so access does concern us. And what does concern us is if the public policy landscape changes and certain medicines don't come to Canada anymore, and then we'll have to go back to like 20 years ago when we had to cross over into the US to get the most innovative medicines, that's absolutely something that really concerns us. And that's why we are presenting a brief at the PMPRB consultation. So really just talking about how regulation changes may affect what type of innovative medications come to Canada. And we want the price of drugs to go down and we want a sustainable, policy for Canada to be able to be able to have access to innovative medicines. We understand that we as payers, we as citizens that pay taxes, we want the price to be as low as sustainably possible. But we don't want to go back to a time when Canada was last in getting innovative medicines. And in order to get innovative medicines, we had to go to the States and mortgage our house in order to go there. So we absolutely do not want to go there. And the precision medicine falls in that, very delicate zone where it's not for everyone. It's for a very small population because it's so rare, because they're rare conditions, they do cost more. And so the decision we have to make as a society is, if we know that there's something that can help these people, will we just say, oh, too bad, it's too expensive? I think that there's a compromise to make there, and we hope that the government can sit down with industry and come up with a good compromise that works for everyone, but that ensures access to innovative medicines for all Canadians. And with CAR-T, we're very lucky because Quebec was one of the first to actually dedicate a specific budget for that, because it was shown to be so promising. And so we're really lucky that we have access to that in Quebec.
I could literally speak with you for hours. You sound like there's like a wealth of information. I think we'll have to probably do a follow-up just on that, on pricing and pharmacare and PMPRB and what does this world look like? So I guess, more pending on that. But we actually have a lot of life science companies that we work with across the globe, a lot of people trying to come into Canada, people who are already here, who are looking for access and getting patients their medications and their innovations. How would the typical company partner with your coalition? What is that relationship look like? How do they work with you? And what are some of the outcomes of those relationships?
Well, so we work a lot with pharma, but we always keep a very arm's length relationship with them. We never, ever lobby for any medication, ever, because we really need to maintain that distance, because most of our funding comes from industry, because who else will fund patient advocacy? There's no government programs for that. And because we have so many nonprofits, we've made the decision to not do fundraising ourselves. I mean, I used to be a fundraiser in my previous life, so I could raise the money, but it's that we don't want to take away from the very small pie, philanthropic pie that we have in Quebec. So we leave that for our organizations, but we partner with industry, and basically what we provide is that patient voice so that they can reflect on their own strategy from a patient perspective. And so we bring the patient perspective to what they're doing, and understanding also, it helps us to know what's coming up in terms of innovations, in terms of pipelines, in terms of what challenges do they see. And then we turn around and we look at our member organizations and we see if there's any commonalities, if there's any common objectives. So for example, industry cares about access to diagnostic testing. So do patient organizations, because patient organizations are seeing that when their patients get access to the proper diagnostic testing, they get the right drugs at the right time for the right patients, and they do better. And so on that front, so basically my role is to talk to all stakeholders, including industry, including government, including clinicians, research organizations, and community and nonprofit and patient advocacy organizations, and then see what are the common objectives that we can actually work together and share our perspectives, and then actually go in that direction and get some concrete public policy results.
It's phenomenal. I love it. And like I said, I've got to speak with you again on another show just to talk about that, because fascinating work. They are definitely very fortunate to have you in this group, leading the charge, certainly a fire in the belly for Quebec, for Canada as well. So I guess lots to learn and lots to see what happens in the weeks, months, and years ahead. So absolutely amazing. We will be leaving a link to Eva, her LinkedIn. If you want to connect with her, partner with her, find out information, we are going to leave that in the show notes. And also feel free to connect with Impetus at impetusdigital.com. We actually do these kinds of things. We actually set up the platforms for these courageous conversations. If you're wanting to work with Eva and other stakeholders to start talking about value-based medicine and how are we incorporating AI and how do we change legislation, these are the kinds of things that we do asynchronously and synchronously in our portal. So feel free to connect with us and we might be able to do some work with you and Eva as well. So thanks for everybody for dropping in. We would appreciate if you could like this and subscribe so other people can find our material. It's been an absolutely wonderful conversation, Eva. You are awesome, and wishing everybody a great day ahead.
Thanks a lot, Natalie. Thanks, everyone.